the weather. Check it out.
Good morning, both to the legal representatives who are present in the hearing room in Edinburgh and to those who are following proceedings on the live link. This morning we have our next witness and questioning will be by Mr. McClelland, who's supported by Dargy, who's one of the solicitors of the inquiry. I'm assisted by Kirsten McMillan, who's another of the solicitors of the inquiry. I think, Mr. McLennan, we're in a position to proceed immediately with Mr. Hall, is that correct?
That's right, my lord, Kenneth Hall.
Right. Good morning, Mr. Hall. As you appreciate, you're about to be asked some questions by Ms. McClelland, counsel to the inquiry, who is sitting opposite you. First, are you prepared to take the oath?
I am.
Right. Sitting where you are, I'd ask you first of all to raise your right hand. Now, if you repeat these words after me, I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth.
that I will tell the truth,
The whole truth.
the whole truth,
But the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hall. Now, you have the microphone which should pick up what you're saying. Because I'm a bit deaf, I'm always conscious of the need to be heard. So maybe speak a bit louder than previously. Now, I'm now turning to the room because I think yesterday the amplification, maybe not what it might have been. I'm getting some quite enthusiastic nods of the head. Now, that's not your responsibility, Mr. Hall, it's our technology. We're trying to address that. I'm getting more enthusiastic nods. And as I say, although it's our responsibility to get the tech right, and those who are assisting are very aware of that, both myself addressing, and perhaps I can just check with my person who I'm getting most information through body language. Am I audible? Okay. As you can see, Mr. Hall, I'm speaking a little bit louder than I would if I was in normal conversation. So appreciate it's difficult. Inevitably, keeping up volume is always a challenge, but anything you can do would be gratefully received, both by me and back of the room. So, Mr. McClelland.
I'm not sure if you ministered the oath to Mr. Hall. I think you were intending to do that and then didn't.
I'm very grateful to...
But
I would have said that. Did administer.
Oh, well, my apologies.
Right, okay. That reassures me that. Reassures me. So if we have taken the oath, Mr. McClelland.
Could I ask you please just to confirm your name?
Kenneth Hall.
And Mr. Hall, have you supplied the inquiry with a witness statement?
I have.
Do you have a copy of that in front of you?
I do, yes.
Does that statement set out fully and truthfully your evidence on the matters that it addresses?
It does.
And is there anything in it that you think needs to be changed or corrected?
No.
And are you content that the inquiry accept that as your evidence?
Yes.
Now, you'll appreciate there are a number of other matters on which I'd like to ask you some questions. And just to put those in context, to begin by asking you about your professional qualifications and experience. You set those out in your statement. Is it correct that you began as an electrical engineer?
Yes,
And then after that, moved on to become a building services engineer?
that's correct.
And then once you were a building services engineer, is it correct that you then specialised as a healthcare building services engineer?
Predominantly in the last 13 years, it's been healthcare.
Now, other witnesses have highlighted that although mechanical and electrical engineering is a familiar label, with mechanical and electrical bundled together, the individual engineers tend to be either electrical or mechanical, or at least to have a bias towards one or the other. Is that the same for you?
Yeah, I'm not a fully qualified mechanical and an electrical engineer, but the job that I do, it's more about processes, so it's not detailed design, but I guess my main specialisation would have been years ago to be electrical.
Okay. And to what extent would you now regard yourself as familiar with the mechanical elements, particularly in the context of hospital ventilation?
Yeah, I have a good understanding because when you were progressing through your career, ultimately you moved into a position where you were maybe leading a team, and the team was mechanical and electrical designers early on in my career. And so by going through that process, you started to understand the other discipline.
Okay. And so should we understand that your knowledge of mechanical engineering elements has come from experience sort of on work on the day-to-day job rather than from formal education and training?
That's correct.
And I'm going to ask you later on about SHTM 0301. Is that something that you're familiar with?
Familiar in the sense I've used it. I'm obviously not a designer with multiplex. I'm aware of it in the same way I would be aware of a Ranger suite of documents.
If you could have a quick look, please, at paragraph 5 of your statement. That's bundle 13 at page 237. Sorry, 237. I think there was perhaps a typo. And we see in paragraph 5 there some bullet points. You refer there to work on the Queen Elizabeth Hospital and to the Glasgow Royal Infirmary and then to the State Hospital at Carstairs. Are these all of the healthcare projects that you worked on, or are they just examples that you've given?
Obviously, the two large ones were the State Hospital and the Queen Elizabeth. And then I've mentioned a selection of small ward upgrades, but they were small scale type projects.
Okay, so those are projects where you haven't necessarily named them in that list.
Yeah.
My Lord, it's been brought to my attention that the oath may not, in fact, have been administered at the outset. So I'm not sure if perhaps we want to remedy that just now.
Right. It's quite interesting because my recollection was that I at least began to administer. Mr. Hall, with apologies for any duplication, if this is duplication, what I will do is I will administer the oath again, and if I fail to do that, I apologize to you and everyone else. It's an interesting reflection that I cannot absolutely remember what happened. I certainly thought I was started. So what we'll do is, would you repeat these words after me? I swear by Almighty,
Swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
and nothing but
Right.
the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Apologies all round. Miss McLennan.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that interruption too, Mr. Hall. And just for the sake of formality, can take it that everything that you've said prior to that administration of the oath was true and full answers.
That's correct.
Those prior healthcare projects that you worked on, what role did you perform on those?
On the state hospital, that was with a mechanical and electrical design company, and so I was in charge of a team of mechanical and electrical engineers that we were designing the project. Originally, it was a revenue type project which moved to a capital funded.
Okay. And what about the Queen Elizabeth project?
Queen Elizabeth, that was more a kind of pre-construction design manager.
Okay. You understand then on both of those projects, your role was that of a mechanical and electrical engineering design manager?
Yeah,
Is that the same role that you carried out on the Sick Kids project?
that's correct.
Did your work on those projects involve responsibility for ventilation systems?
Could I clarify, but when you say responsibility, you mean design responsibility?
Well, perhaps the easiest way is for you to tell me what your responsibility was for ventilation systems in those roles.
Yeah, so in terms of an MEP design manager, it's about managing a team of designers. Multiplex don't have their own design in-house, so they outsource it. So it was very much about managing an external organisation.
Okay. You used the acronym MEP there. Just for clarity, could you confirm what MEP stands for?
Mechanical, electrical and plumbing.
So to what extent, if at all, in those other roles, did you have responsibility for compliance of the ventilation systems with NHS guidance, such as SHTMs?
Could you repeat the question?
So on those other healthcare projects, the ones that you worked on before the Sick Kids, to what extent, if any, did you have responsibility for compliance of the ventilation system with NHS guidance, such as SHTMs?
Well, on the Queen Elizabeth project, it's a similar arrangement where that's an outsourced design company, and with the state hospital, the design responsibility was with the organisation, which I was part of.
Okay, so do you mean by that the responsibility on the Queen Elizabeth Hospital was the responsibility for compliance with the ventilation guidance that lie with the external companies, and so was not part of your role?
Yes, I mean, I think contractually I'm not a contract expert, and I'm sure there's some link, but in terms of the actual physical design, it was outsourced, and that company was responsible for interpreting the standards and the guidance and providing a solution that met the guidance that effectively was the client's requirements.
Okay, and in your day-to-day work on that project, were you looking out for compliance with guidelines?
As part of a team, we were, I mean, again, the role is about facilitating. So it's interacting with client and also with the design team and ensuring the flow of information and the outputs that are required to meet the client's requirements are met. So you are part of a team. But in terms of specifically looking out for a specific compliance, I didn't see that as part of my role.
And was that the same for the other project, the state hospital project, or did
It's
you?
quite different in that sense because it's you're employed as a consulting engineer and the firm's employed as a designer, and so you are responsible for interpretation of the guidance.
Okay. Now, you say in your statement that you joined Multiplex in 2011. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. And you joined as an M&E design manager. Is that correct?
The official title was M&E manager, However, it was more specialising in the pre-construction element rather than the next phase, which is obviously the construction of it.
Okay. And at a different point in your statement, the label that you use for your role on the Sick Kids project was an M&E design manager. Are you really meaning the same thing there, or is there a difference?
It's the same role that I performed. It was just if the email signature had M&E design manager on it, so for specific jobs you might have to do a specific role.
And you said a little bit a moment ago about what that role of M&E design manager entails, but just expand a little bit on that for us, please.
Yeah. So effectively, Multiplex don't employ designers, outsourced, and the main role is about managing an M&E design house and effectively creating a route map, which at this point we were looking at what we needed to do to get to financial close. So you're looking at what requirements that the client has and what does the design house need to ensure that they can then design to the client's requirements. And then it's about communication and interacting between both parties to ensure we meet our obligations.
Okay. And to what extent would you regard you yourself as having had design responsibilities on the Sick Kids project?
Myself as in personal responsibility,
Yeah,
or Multiplex?
No, you personally.
Well, I didn't see it as me personally being responsible, but obviously as a responsible person and you're part of an organisation and you're working as a team, ultimately we're all responsible to deliver what the client wants.
Now, you explain in your statement that you joined the Sick Kids project at the start of the preferred bidder stage. Is that correct?
That's correct. It was March 2000.
So, just to state the obvious, you were not involved in the submission of IHSL's tender?
No.
Or in the competitive dialogue procedure that preceded it?
No.
As far as you know, who was it that handled the mechanical and electrical engineering parts of IHSL's tender?
From my understanding, it was led by our partners, so that was Wallace Whittle and Mercury had a large involvement in it at the initial stage, and then working with the Multiplex team.
We're concerned in this set of hearings with events up to financial close when the project agreement was concluded. And given your start date on the project, therefore going to focus on the preferred bidder period. So from IHSL's appointment as preferred bidder up to financial close. From your perspective, what was the objective of the preferred bidder period?
My objective was to ensure that by financial close on the MEP side that we had created a route map to deliver what was required ultimately for Multiplex to achieve financial close.
Okay, if we could perhaps bring up Bundle 10, Volume 1, page 87. And Mr. Hall, this is a letter appointing IHSL as the preferred bidder project. Is that a document that you've seen before or were familiar with at the time?
I've not seen that letter before, no.
Okay. If you see after the two paragraphs A and B, see that what the letter says there is that the board has approved the recommendation to appoint IHSL preferred bidder for this project on the basis of its final tender. You see that. That's just to let you know what this letter is doing. If we move on to page 92, see there that there's this is a schedule to the letter, and it's headed up terms of preferred bidder appointment. And see there in the box beside 1.1 programme says that IHSL will use its best endeavours to diligently progress the project to financial close, and it gives the date of 2nd of October 2014. Is that consistent with your understanding of what was going on in the preferred bidder period?
Yeah, my recollection was we were working to September, and that's what I've stated in my statement.
And if we just, the box below that, 1.2, says there that IHSL shall not be permitted to make any amendments to its final tender, except where provided for within this preferred bidder appointment. IHSL acknowledge and accepts that the rules of competitive dialogue only permit fine-tuning and clarification of IHSL's final tender at preferred bidder stage, opposed to material amendments which may have a commercial impact in relation to IHSL's final tender. Again, did you understand that to be one of the conditions of the preferred bidder stage?
It wasn't something I'd had any involvement or detail in.
You weren't aware of that?
No.
And if we go on to page 95, please. Section here dealing
Sorry, my fault. I lost concentration for a moment. What you were not aware of, Mr. Hall, was?
Have we got the
page 92.
Still on 1.2.
1.2, that's right.
So, as I say, my fault entirely, Mr. What was it that you were not aware of?
Well, I was asked if I was aware about amendments to final tender and the specifics that are recorded within the document, and I wasn't aware of the wording. Content.
Thank you.
I think it's probably my fault then, Mr. Hall. I think you've perhaps misunderstood what my question was. What I intended to ask was whether you were aware that it was a condition of the preferred bidder period that IHSL were not to make amendments to the final tender, except in limited circumstances.
It's not something I can recollect as being at the forefront of my mind.
Okay. If we put it the other way, perhaps, did you understand that IHSL were free in any respect to depart from what they'd put into the tender?
Well, I mean, in a general level, with any contract where you get to preferred bidder stage, you know, my understanding would be you would be enhancing what was already done at the first stage, because that's what allowed you to get through. So, on a general level, my understanding would be that in any bid that you weren't wholesale changing, you know, what you've already done.
And if we move on to page 94, please. Sorry, my mistake. 95. 4.4. The condition here that relates to the technical schedules says that IHSL shall use its best endeavours to diligently develop the following IHSL technical schedules final tender, whether it be NPD project agreement. Then one of the highlighted sections is Part 6, construction matters. The reference there to Section 4, the project co-proposals. See that?
Yeah.
And did you understand that that was part of the purpose of the third bidder period, to diligently develop the project co-proposals?
Yes.
Then the final paragraph just at the bottom of the page says, these technical schedules of the final tender shall be finalised in conjunction with the board to ensure that both parties are satisfied, these technical schedules firstly address the board's construction requirements. This shall be a key part of the early stages of the preferred bidder period. Again, did you understand that that was part of the function of the preferred bidder period?
Yes. The BCRs were our key document, and it was one that I used throughout the preferred bidder stage.
If we move on to page 96, see at paragraph 4.6, a reference to the board's construction requirements. What it says there is that the board's construction requirements shall be based upon the version issued by the board, part of the invitation to submit final tender. And again, were you aware that those were the board construction requirements that were form the basis of the work in the third bidder period?
I recall that there was various iterations, but I was aware that the BCR document was the one that we had to work to.
And in the performance of your role, what extent did you need to understand the board's construction requirements?
I had to have a good insight and understanding of the BCRs, yes.
And in particular, the elements that related to mechanical and electrical engineering elements.
Yeah, so there was a section 8, which was the mechanical and electrical, and that was a key document for me.
Okay. I mean, is it fair to put it this way, that you needed to understand the board's requirements for mechanical and electrical engineering matters, and to make sure that IHSL's M&E proposals would meet them?
Yes.
And perhaps a daft question, but how did you derive your understanding of the board's requirements, M&E elements?
Well, initially when I joined the project, obviously our team was quite in place, and, you know, for instance, the synergy between the initial stages to the preferred bidder in terms of, say, our M&E designers, they were ahead of me in terms of the understanding. So it was all about, first of all, sitting down with the key people there and getting an understanding of where they saw the project and what they needed. And then it was very much for me to look at what the key documents were, to review and understand, and then together with our designers create a kind of route map to get us to financial close in the time period.
Okay, so you referred there to the designers being ahead of you and part of a team that was already in place when you arrived. Was that a reference to Wallace Whittle?
Yes.
And you said that you sat down with them. You mean that, did they give you a briefing on their understanding of the requirements, or how did that work?
Yeah, it was very much, I was introducing myself because I was new to the project, and then I was, I guess, feeding off them and what their understanding was, because they had been involved in the initial bid.
And did you read the board's construction requirements yourself?
Yes.
And did you read the ISFT and the ITP documentation from the tender period?
I had there was the initial BCR, which had the environmental matrix in. I think that was Appendix C from memory, but so there was that document, and then I had the one for the preferred bidder stage. And there were other documents as well that, in terms of the Hull and Kirkwood information.
Okay, so when you were talking there about versions, I think you said described it as the initial board construction requirements. By that, do you mean the set that appeared in the tender documentation issued by the board?
Yeah.
Okay. And then you also referred to a version for the preferred bidder stage. So was that a different set, or was it the same set that had been in the tender documents?
No, it had been upgraded. It was the next revision along, and then that had a few iterations during the preferred bidder stage from memory.
Okay, we'll come to that, the development of that later on. And that's the board's construction requirement side of things. What about the project company's proposals? How did you begin to build up an understanding of those?
Well, it was very much about way to develop a route map to get to the financial close position. And so the ultimate aim was the project close proposals that we would be submitting 6 months later. And so to me, it was just a process of identifying what we had and what we had to do to achieve the financial close position.
Did you read IHSL's tender?
Not fully, no.
Read the parts that related to mechanical and electrical engineering?
From memory, not in any great detail, to be honest.
And so from where did you develop an understanding of how the IHSL team as a whole would meet the board's construction requirements in relation to M&E matters?
Because I was coming in from it fresh, I was really tacking it that, we had the board's construction requirements, and then we would then have the dialogue and the discussions to develop effectively what the client's requirements were to ensure that we could deliver our project co-proposals in 6 months' time.
And you also referred to some other documents. I think you referred to Hulley and Kirkwood documents. Insofar as there were important documents for your understanding of the requirements at that early stage, can you tell us what those were?
Yeah, the main one I recall was this kind of thermal report where the Hull and Kirkwood had been engaged to do some work on Edinburgh in the Royal Infirmary, where they had issues, and then the ultimate result was that there was a kind of suggestion that there was a mixed mode ventilation required, and then there was strategy document and drawings, which that all formed part of the reference design, as I understood it. That was more indicative, but it wasn't mandatory. But it was a useful background to understand what had gone on so far and what really the client's aspirations were.
Okay, so you mentioned there the Hulley and Kirkwood thermal report. That's a document that we'll have a look at a bit later on. And you also mentioned, I think, a strategy document. Could you just say a little bit more about what that was, please?
Yeah, so it was more about the kind of servicing of the building, plant room layouts. It's not unusual in projects. I've seen it before. There's no design responsibility given with it, but it's given you an indication as to, one option that could possibly work for that particular reference design.
Okay, you'll be aware that one matter of interest to the inquiry is the compliance of the ventilation system with NHS guidance, and in particular SHTM 0301. How familiar were you with that guidance when you joined the project?
Familiar with it in terms of what it was and what it stood for, and the layout of the document, yeah.
And in your statement, you refer to SHTM 0301 amongst other guidance. And what you explain, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, I'm going to try and just summarise my understanding of it, is that to apply that guidance to any particular healthcare project, there needs to be a process of discussion, judgment, and decision making. So that it's not just a matter for engineers, but you need clinical involvement and so on. Is that a fair summary of how you would understand it? Now, is it always the case that you need to have that process of discussion, or are there some parameters or circumstances where the requirements of the guidance are actually clear-cut?
In relation to SHTMO 301,
Yes.
my experience is that their SHO 301, the starting point is guidance, and that's how it was written. And in reality, in that document, there can be contradictions, items not aligned, it might be out of date in terms of technology. So my view is that if you're designing anything, and you're relating to that, it's a starting point, not the end point.
Okay. If we could go please to bundle 1 at page 149. This is just to let you see the title page, Mr. Hall, of the document that we're looking at. This is Scottish Health Technical Memorandum 0301, Ventilation for Healthcare Premises, Part A, Design and Validation. See down at the bottom, it's dated February 2014. So this would be the version in force at the time you began work in the preferred bidder period.
Yeah.
And if we could go to page 230, please. We see here, this is section 7 guidance, and it's headed up specialised ventilation systems. And just reading from there, it says, this section contains design information for a range of healthcare ventilation applications. Following departments will require a degree of specialised ventilation. And then there's a long list of departments. And third bullet down says critical areas and high dependency units of any type. And then below that, isolation facilities. And if we move forward, please, following page 231, just at paragraph 7.3, says design information for many of these applications given in Appendix 1, Table A1, Appendix 2, following chapters within the section. So on. It's not possible within this existing document definitive guidance for every healthcare specific ventilation application. Additional detailed guidance may be issued in course in the form of supplements. And if we move forward to page 287, you see there Appendix 1, recommended air change rates. And would you understand that to be the appendix that was referred to in the paragraphs that we looked at just a moment ago?
Yeah.
And if we look on that table, do we see there that there's an entry? The first entry is for general ward. Reading along the table, we see that the required or the recommended air changes per hour are 6. See that?
Yep.
Then 2 down, we've got single room. Again, the recommended air change 6. There's also a provision there for pressure arrangements. And would you understand that to mean balanced or negative in terms of the pressure arrangements?
For single bedrooms, I would understand it balanced or negative, but in a general ward, it's not defined.
Yeah, so in the general ward column, pressure column, we have what might neutrally be described as a hyphen. So one interpretation might be that that means negative, but your interpretation is that it means that it's not just simply not defined.
It's not defined, and that's an example of where I've said that the SHTMs are a starting point, and that's where you would then refer to medical colleagues or end users or the clinical team to understand how that ward would operate.
Now, is that your personal interpretation of it, or is that a generally accepted interpretation that the pressure requirements for a general ward are undefined?
It's my understanding.
Is it one that, so far as you know, your colleagues in that industry would share, or is there any debate or disagreement about that? far as you're aware.
To be honest, I couldn't. It's not something I've discussed with colleagues, so I couldn't really comment on it. But it does go back to my original point that it's a starting point, and by taking that and going to the clinical team and the end users, it would be clear how that department was going to operate, and then it would also be clear as to the pressure regime that should be maintained in it.
And if we've lost the document, I think, but if we could just have that back on, there we go. If you read a bit further down, you see an entry for critical care areas, about 8 or 9 lines down. We see there that the recommended air change per hour is 10, and the recommended pressure arrangement is positive to 10 pascals. See that?
Yeah.
Then reading along at the end of the line, comment that says that isolation rooms may be negative pressure. So do we see there that critical care areas have different recommended air change and pressure arrangements from general wards and single rooms?
Yeah.
And what's your understanding of the reason for that?
The reasons for it is it's obviously a different department, and it requires a greater air change based on this table. And so the type of patient is obviously more critical than a further down, and maybe you would look at a general ward.
And what's your understanding of the reason why a critical patient might need different ventilation parameters?
I don't have that expertise to be able to comment on.
Are you able to comment on whether it's related to the risk of infection?
No.
Second, please. If we go to page 232, please, that document. If we just read from paragraph 7.6 there, it says that the supply of air to a room has 4 main functions: dilute airborne contamination, control air movement within, such that the transfer of airborne contaminants from less clean to cleaner areas is minimised, control the temperature and, if necessary, the humidity of the space to assist the removal of and dilute waste gases where used. Were you aware of that part of the guidance? Not that part of the guidance, the concept that's articulated there.
We understand the purpose of a ventilation scheme, but when it starts to go into the technicalities and of airborne contamination, then my knowledge is limited.
Okay. Now, if we go back to the table A1, which is page 287, I think. Now, I'm not an engineer, of course, Mr. Hall. Those recommendations that we see there for critical care areas, are those not quite clear? In the sense that rooms in critical care are to have 10 air changes per hour and 10 pascals of positive pressure.
The table is clear, but it has to be applied to a project, and it needs a wider audience to conclude if in fact that is correct. My understanding is that they are recommended air change rates.
So the recommendation is
The recommendation, but behind that there's a process, in my opinion.
And just to be clear about it, are you yourself not sure whether the different air change pressure arrangements for critical care are related to the need to protect, greater need for protection that patients in the critical care department have?
My understanding of infection and how all these different departments interact is limited, and I feel that there's other experts out there that would know, and that may well be because my role is not a designer, and therefore I don't see that I really need to have that level of expertise.
Okay, I hear what you say. I hear you say that you're not a designer and your expertise doesn't lie in understanding why particular parameters are set. But if I could just press you a little bit on that, just so I can understand what the limit of your knowledge and expertise was. Did you understand that critical care had different ventilation requirements because the patients who were in there were more vulnerable than typical patient?
I understand the terminology critical care, and I understand that it is a higher risk patient than a normal ward. But I feel that it's, I'm getting drawn into something that's quite detailed, and it's just not something I feel I would need to know. That in a design of a hospital, there are a lot of experts who are far more qualified than me, and if there was doubt, that would be the purpose of having them involved.
Okay, so if you were on the project and hypothetically somebody was to raise the question of, why is it that critical care's got these parameters and general ward has different ones? Do you seek out advice from somebody else about that, or would you be able to answer that question yourself?
No, I would seek out further advice, and that would be because we outsource our designers and they may well be able to respond to it at a certain level, or we would put it through as an RFI or further clarification in terms of the clinical side of the team.
Okay, if we stand back from all of that, and if you're working on a project and you're told that a room's going to be in critical care and that it's to comply with SHTM 0301, would your starting point be that it should have 10 air changes per hour, 10 pascals of positive pressure?
I mean, my starting point would be what have our designers prepared, and what's their advice.
If I can put that question the other way around, if you're on a project and there's a room in critical care where something less than 10 air changes per hour or 10 pascals of positive pressure has been specified, is that something that you would query, or would you just accept it as deliberate choice?
It feels quite hypothetical, the question, and it's in what context. How would it have come about, or are we specifically looking at somebody's flagged an issue with a project room, or I think it would really be dependent on circumstances at the time.
We see there that the table, or if we could have that document back up on the screen, please. The table has entries for general ward and single room. What was your understanding of the difference between things?
General wards having listed as 6 air changes, and then the single room as 6 air changes.
Yeah, so general ward there as the first entry table and single room as the third entry. What would you understand to be the difference between things?
Well, the single room, by its nature, is a single bedroom, is my understanding. And then the general ward is obviously more than one single, so it could be a 4-bed ward, a multi-bed ward, but more than one bed, basically.
Okay, we're finished with that document, thank you. And if we could now look at another document, which is in bundle 5, page 376. Now, you see there that this document is titled B1 Critical Care Clinical Output-Based Specification. Is that a document that you recognise?
I'm aware of the clinical outbased specifications. Yeah.
Okay, so this, just to let you know what it is, this is part of the project agreement. It's in Schedule Part 6 as part of the board's construction requirements. So do you recall that there are clinical output-based specifications for the various departments?
Yeah, yeah, I had a copy of them.
We just read through that document. Go please to page 377. I'm just going to read parts from this, Mr. Paul. It says this department will provide a comprehensive care service. This includes paediatric intensive care, high dependency unit, surgical neonatal unit, children. Then a bit further down under the heading scope of the service, main objective of the department, provide excellence, medical, nursing and paramedical care to patients who require intensive care, high dependency care. And if we read on through that document, page 379, we see there a list of the separate rooms in the department. Is that what you'd understand that to be?
Yeah.
So we see there the headings. Paediatric intensive care unit, 8 beds, low acuity, 6 beds, neonatal HDU, 4 cots, high acuity, 6 beds. Do you understand that to be the bedding requirements of the board for the critical care department?
Yeah.
And do we see there that below those headings that I've just read out, some of the rooms are identified as isolation cubicles, but the others are not identified as isolation cubicles? See that? Was your understanding that isolation facilities were required and identified in that list by the board?
On a general level, yes. I mean, that level of detail was not something that I was going into.
I think you said you were familiar with this document. Had you read it at the time?
No, it's not the sort of document from an MEP. My experience is they're more reference documents, and the output specs are traditionally, in my experience, used at the 1 to 50s, where you would have user groups and the architect, and they're developing 1 to 50 layouts. It's more a secondary type document for an MEP engineer.
Okay, so when you refer to it as a secondary type document, what do you mean by that? Just
So,
in the particular context of a mechanical and electrical engineer trying to understand what mechanical and electrical systems a health board wants.
yeah. So from my point of view, obviously as a non-designer, I had these documents to, look at if there was a issue and somebody was talking about a department and there might be to check if there was a requirement for that. I think as a designer, become more relevant in developing, the MEP design.
Okay, so would you regard this as a document interest for Wallace Whittle, but not one that you yourself would have to be particularly familiar with?
Not in the detail, but as a reference document, in a suite of documents that you may have to dip in and out at certain times.
And we go down to page 388, please. You see a heading there, Mr. Hall, environmental and services requirements. See that?
Yeah.
And if we go down over the page 389, see the fourth bullet point, reading from there, it says flexibility in the use of critical care beds, both high dependency and intensive care, key to maintaining efficient use of high specification beds. All three critical care areas must be co-located. And if we read down another 4 bullet points, it says that all paediatric intensive care units and high dependency unit bed spaces are required to be of the same specification to allow the greatest flexibility of use. Were you aware of those requirements for the critical care department?
Not that those specific requirements, no. As I said earlier, that my experience is that type of requirement is getting brought out at these 1 to 50s with the user groups reflecting to the main one being the architect at the user group meetings as they develop the architectural layouts.
And just in general terms, did you understand that the board's expectation was that all of the bed spaces be capable of use for all purposes?
In reality, no. I wasn't aware of that.
I think actually my question wasn't very well put. What I mean is, were you aware the board had a requirement that all of these bed spaces be to the same specification to allow the greatest flexibility of use?
Could I clarify in terms of the same specification? Is that the ventilation specification you're talking about, or is it just the bed spaces and whatever's in one bed space is to be the same?
Well, you're right to point that out, because the paragraph that I referred you to doesn't say whether it's ventilation specification or any other specification. It just says specification. What I'm trying to get to is your understanding of the extent to which the board required all of the bed spaces in critical care be of the same specification, whether it's a ventilation specification or anything else. That's something that you were aware of.
It wasn't something that I was considering. In reality, in terms of the environmentals, we had the environmental matrix that effectively gave the MEP the answers that we needed.
So are you saying that, I think what you said was that for the designers, the environmental matrix was the more important document than sources we've been looking at just now?
Yeah, I mean, if there wasn't an environmental matrix in place, then the designer would have had to go through these in a lot more detail and extract what was required and then a process in place. But then to me, it appeared that that work had already been done.
Already done and reflected in the environmental matrix. Okay, we're finished with that document now, thank you. So I want to turn now to that question of what you understood about the environmental matrix. And again, to save time, I'll try to feed back my understanding of what you're saying in your statement. As what I've taken from your statement is that as you understood it, the board's requirements for the ventilation system were set out in the environmental matrix. Is that your understanding at the time? And that those were fixed requirements unless and until the board decided that it wanted to change them. Was that your understanding at the time?
Yes, that's correct.
And in saying that, you quote two particular parts of the board construction requirements. If we could just go to the ISFT version of the board construction requirements. These are in bundle 3, page 259. I'm going to this set, Mr. Hall, because I understand that this is probably the set that was in place at the start of the third bidder period.
Yeah.
Does that seem to you to be correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. So page 259, this is a section of the board construction requirements at that time, headed up NHS requirements. It reads, in addition to the standards listed in paragraph 2.4, unless the board has expressed elsewhere in the board construction requirements specific and different requirement, facilities shall comply with, not be limited to, the provisions of the NHS requirements. They may be amended from time to time. Then there's a list of various sources down at H, HTMs and SHTMs. See that?
Yeah.
Now, was this a paragraph that you thought significant when working out to what degree it was necessary to comply with SHTMs?
Well, I didn't specifically go through each one to try and work out. It just seemed obvious to me that the information that we had seemed to tie up in a way that you were being told this is what the board wants.
Go to page 339, please. Now, we see at the bottom there, this is section 8 of the board construction requirements, and headed up mechanical and electrical engineering requirements. Project Co shall provide the works to comply with the environmental matrix. Now, in coming to your view about the role of the environmental matrix, were you relying on what that said there, or was it just the assumption that you made from the existence of the environmental matrix that it was required?
Well, obviously, the original document that I had the environmental matrix as Appendix C in the BCRs. My understanding was that the BCR was the key document that we had to comply with. But in addition to that, when you went to see the definition at the front of the document, it defined the board's, I can't remember the exact wording, but it was the board's requirements that it defined. And then the other documents also seemed to align in terms of, there was a C.8.3 where it said that you had to comply with the board's environmental matrix, and you actually had to confirm that in your tender, was what I observed. And then when you looked at the actual, the other aspects, in terms of, say, the room data sheets, it was actually telling you that you weren't getting room sheets, but you were getting the environmental matrix. And to me, that was a key client briefing document. So the whole thing seemed to tie up, and therefore, for me, it wasn't a case to then start to go through line by line in the BCR to see, HTMs or the other points that were listed.
And just to be clear about the different sources you were talking about there, the first was you referred to a definition. Was it the definition of the environmental matrix in the board construction requirements that you?
Yeah, so at the front, there's obviously a series of definitions, and one of them defines the environmental matrix.
Yeah. Perhaps just go to that. That's page 246. Is that the definition that you had in mind?
Requirements of the board, yeah, that was the one.
Okay. You see at the end there, brackets, the words as varied, amended, or supplemented from time to time in accordance with the project agreement. To what extent did you understand that the environmental matrix was a fluid or changeable document?
I mean, at the time, it wasn't something I considered. I was basically looking at, what are the client's requirements in terms of the environmental information. And so, because it all tied up, then it seems straightforward that that's what we would use, and that's what we did use.
I think in addition to that definition, you also sounded to me like you were referring to some of the tender documents. Is that right?
Yeah, so there was it was really when I started on the project, some of these items were identified to me, and one of them was about that there had been this item in the tender that said that you had to confirm that you were complying with that.
You say complying with that, you mean complying with
the board's environmental matrix.
Okay, and the third source or the third point that you referred to was this thing about not getting room data sheets. What was your understanding there?
Yeah, so there was no room data sheets for the project. However, there was a series of other documents, and one of them was the environmental matrix.
Now, you've referred to those, but I think I'm right in saying, correct me if I'm wrong about this, that you didn't read through the tender documents. So were these sources that how did you become aware of these other sources? Didn't read the tender documents.
Yeah, so obviously at the initial stages, you're trying to get a grasp of what are the client's requirements and where do we stand. And to be honest, I can't really remember whether it was a discussion with Wallace Whittle when I was maybe querying it with them to see just what their understanding was, because they'd been involved in the first, or it was our own team. But in my mind, I was checking off how legitimate what you were getting told at the time. And so, that was something that when I did see that element, it was a case of that confirmed in my mind that it backed up what the things I've been told, and therefore that's what we should proceed with.
Okay, I'm not sure I quite followed that. Do you mean that you gleaned an understanding from discussions with Wallace Whittle and then went back and had a look at the tender documents, or?
Yeah, because we had the obviously we've got the Hurling-Kirkwood documents, a series of documents, and I'm doing what I would call an audit in my mind to be able to take it forward to get a route map to financial close. And so, but you weren't coming from it from a point of view that perhaps you would look at it now. It's a general thing that you're looking at to review to understand what you have to do. So I wasn't looking at things on the basis of challenging anything. It was just about trying to get a feel for what information we had and what we needed to develop to get to financial close, really.
We'll maybe have a closer look at some of the tender documents a bit later on. Could we go please to page 264 of that document that was on the screen? This is paragraph 2.5 from the board construction requirements, Mr. Hall. I'm just reading from the second paragraph. It says that where contradictory standards or advice are apparent within the terms of this section, so on, appendices, and subject to the foregoing paragraph, then 1. Most onerous standard or advice shall take precedence. 2. The most recent standard advice shall take precedence. The more onerous requirement is used, the board will have the right to decide what constitutes the more onerous requirement. And a bit further down, fifth paragraph. In certain instances, NHS publications include a number of options for alternative solutions. Where the board has defined their preference specifically, Project Co shall adopt these preferences as a mandatory requirement. And then the bottom paragraph, the avoidance of doubt, the board considers NHS publications reflect minimum standards. Any alternatives proposed by Project Co shall provide a similar or enhanced level of service and quality. Were those provisions that you were familiar with at the time or not?
I remember a debate on this on some, I think it might have been external lighting. As a project developed, I can't remember exactly what part in the project it came on, but if the question is in relation to ventilation and the environmental matrix, is that the question?
Yes. If you were aware of these provisions at the time, did they, and if so, how, influence the way you looked at the environmental matrix?
I mean, it didn't influence because my understanding was that you had a client's requirement and therefore there was no reason for anybody to then challenge to see if there was a more onerous or a contradictory, because you know, the item in 2.3 in the previous page was telling you that the board, if the alternative and it aligned with the section 8, then that was the document that you would use.
Okay, we're finished with that document for the time being. If we can now take a look at the environmental matrix from the start of the preferred bidder stage, and that's at bundle 4, page 131. Now, is this a document that you're familiar with?
Yes, I recall that one.
Okay, and this is the front page of it. Just see it's headed up Royal Hospital for Sick Children, Department for Clinical Neurosciences, Edinburgh. And to be clear, my understanding is that this is the version that, in the ISFT, so it's the version that existed at the start of the preferred bidder period. We'll proceed on that basis, but if there's anything in it that you think suggests that's not when it's from, please do let me know. And we see on the list, there's an index there with a list of department codes. And if you go down that, do you see that the fifth entry, B1, and then critical care, HDU, neonatal surgery, do you see that?
Yeah.
Did you understand the HDU to stand for high dependency unit?
Yeah, I understand HDU, yeah.
And that code B1, you recall that the clinical output specification we looked at a moment ago had that code on it. So did you understand that the parameters set out in this document for that department have to meet the requirements of clinical output specification?
I'm not sure it's something that I specifically thought about. I mean, the key point, I guess, to make is that up to financial close, our designers weren't doing detailed design, and therefore, you know, the real detail and the real interrogation to the level of going into each department is probably more at detailed design rather than at up to financial close.
Okay, perhaps not a matter that you thought about at the time, but is it a sensible proposition that insofar as the environmental matrix sets out ventilation parameters for Department B1, those should be parameters which help achieve the objectives set out in the clinical output specification? We go on to page 132, please. We see here a list of guidance notes for the environmental matrix. Are these guidance notes that you were familiar with at the time?
Yeah, I was aware of them.
See that guidance note 1 reads, "This workbook is prepared for the reference design stage, an easier reference tool to replace ADB, RDS, M&E sheets, the environmental criteria elements described in these sheets." If we read down to guidance note 5, it says ventilation air change rates, the use of natural ventilation in patient areas shall be reviewed throughout the detailed design process to ensure a maximum internal temperature of 25 degrees centigrade is not exceeded, and so on. So was that an indication that air change rates were to be subject of review through the design process?
It wasn't something that I considered. My interpretation of the guidance notes were that it was the author had effectively put down his working notes into the document. And from the working notes that you then had the figures that effectively our designers had to use.
So do we take it from that you regarded the room-specific parameters that set out later in environmental matrix as what you had to follow, and these guidance notes were, well, it wasn't necessary even to take account of them?
Perhaps it's strong to say not take account of, but the whole essence of an environmental matrix is it's meant to make the process easier than having it in room data sheets. And so, in my opinion, I guess that your aim is to have a document, and typically it's in Excel, the document, and you have the tabs along the bottom, and you know, you're clicking in and out of each department. So sometimes a sort of PDF gives you the impression that it's a manuscript that you're going through, whereas you know, the Excel version is that you are clicking into each department, and my assumption is that that's the final results that are meant to be for that department, and that's what has been agreed.
Okay, but even looking at it in that way, there's guidance note 5, even if you take that just as a working note from the author, does that not suggest that air change rates can't be regarded as settled because they're going to be reviewed throughout the detailed design process?
It's not really possible to be reviewing ventilation rates during a detailed design phase, in my opinion. The process in terms of detailed design, that there are fundamental elements that you have to work through. For financial close, we had to assess the building size, plant room size, corridors, and to be able to do that, you need a defined element of the room parameters in terms of environmental. So the suggestion that, you know, to do it in detailed design, struggle to follow.
Okay, but if we read down then to guidance note 15, and I'm just going to read parts of this, I'm not going to read it all, but you see there, typical bedroom, design criteria, SHTM 0301, go on. And below that, HDU, high dependency unit bed areas, design criteria. HBN 57 gives specific guidance, as well as SHTM 0301, especially Appendix 1 for air change rates, 10 air changes per hour supply. And if we read further down, dark text, critical care areas, design criteria, SHTM 0301, especially Appendix 1 for air change rates, 10 air changes per hour supply. So just the first point, when that talks about 10 air changes per hour, that's consistent with Appendix 1, SHTM 0301 for critical care departments. Is that correct?
Yeah, 10 air changes.
So that's a statement as one would expect. It's not a statement of a parameter that would surprise a ventilation engineer.
No.
Okay. And if we go on to the following page, 33, you see at the top it's headed up room function reference sheet. There's room function reference sheet. Following table details reference templates which are used to populate cells within the environmental matrix. Refer to individual department sheet for individual room environmental conditions. What was your understanding of the function of this sheet?
I was asked that when I attended the interview, and my view was that it wasn't something I had any knowledge of. The matrix was really the populated figures in each department was my focus.
Okay, is this another part of the matrix that you didn't think it was necessary to read or understand?
Yeah, because ultimately you have a document that my understanding was the client's requirements, and therefore there's no reason to unpick work that somebody else has done. Don't know how it's been done, but if it's been getting told to you that it's somebody's requirements and it's all laid out in tabular form, then my belief was that that's what we should use.
And just because it will relate to something coming later on, if we look down the list of room functions, left-hand column, you see about halfway down, there's an entry for HDU.
Yeah.
And then we just read across through all the columns, we get to one under the heading of ventilation supply, you see 10 air changes per hour.
Yeah.
But that's something that you wouldn't have been giving close attention at the time.
No.
And if we move on to page 135, please. Now, do you recognise this as one sheet in the element that sets out parameters for particular rooms? Is this the part that you were referring to a moment ago when you were describing what you regarded as the board's requirements? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. And do we see in the very left-hand column, and in fact across the top of the page, there's a reference to B1. All it says is B1 in the left-hand column, but the title at the top of the page reads B1 critical. They all still got it. I've lost mine. across the top it says B1 critical care HDU neonatal surgery. That?
Up on the screen's blank.
Oh yeah, mine too.
I'm in the same. Right.
It's back.
Okay, we're back. Yes. So this was really just to. Oh. I wonder, perhaps, my lord, I note the time. If we've got slight technical difficulties, it may be appropriate to take the break just now.
Well, we would have taken coffee break at about 11:30, so perhaps we could rise for about 15 minutes, and if we can store the content to the screen. Mr. Hall, I hope you have the opportunity of getting a cup of coffee, but we'll ask you to go to your room. Now, I understand our technical issue has been resolved, although as soon as I say that, I'll probably be proved wrong. But I have every confidence in the people who actually know about these things. Could we ask Mr. Hall to rejoin us? Ms. McLennan.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Hall, I hope you'll recall that before we had our little break, we're looking at this part of the environmental matrix. And just to reorientate ourselves, heading on the top tells us that this page is to do with E1, critical care department. Now, if we look to the left-hand column, you see there that given the department code B1, you understand that to relate to the critical care department. Yeah. Then in the next column, department name, PQ and HDUs, would you understand that to be pediatric intensive care unit and high dependency unit?
Yeah.
Yeah. And in the third column along, if you look down from the top, we've got a section for pediatric intensive care, 8 beds, low acuity, 6 beds, neonatal HDU, 4 cots, high acuity, 6 beds. Do you understand those to be the bed spaces that the board wanted to have in critical care department?
Yeah.
And if you look to the next column along, if we do this section by section, so beside pediatric intensive care 8 beds box, we see there that that's further divided down to single bed isolation cubicle. Next column along tells us that there's 2 of those. Then a single bed cubicle tells us that there's 2 of those. And then an open plan bay with 4 beds, of which there's to be 1. Again, does that set out what you understood the board wanted to have in terms of bed spaces in the critical care department? If we read on down for each of the other areas, we see a similar set of details telling us about bed spaces that appear in the critical care department. Is that what that shows us?
Yeah.
Was that what you understood at the time, back in the preferred bidder period?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't obviously doing a forensic analysis of each line and checking it, but loosely that what you've outlined is what understanding was.
Okay. And what I'm about to try and do may be a little bit difficult, but if we have that document and scroll it along, so that we'll try it first of all, so that the leftmost column that appears on the screen is the one headed up department subgroup. And can we just zoom out a little bit, please? Try and get more of the, again, if we can. Yes, I think that's going to work for our purposes. So just by way of example, if in that column that's headed up room name, if we look at the bed spaces, but let's ignore for the time being ones that are called, have isolation in their name. So we see there the PQ 8 beds, there's an entry for a single bed cubicle, for example. You see that, Mr. Hall?
Yeah.
If we read along that line till we get to the column that's headed up ventilation supply, you see there an entry for 4 air changes per hour.
Yeah.
And I don't think we need to do it for all of them, but if we were to look at all of the bed spaces in critical care department, see that all of them have a ventilation supply air changes per hour of 4. See that?
Yes.
Yeah. And is that inconsistent with what appears in the guidance note? particular guidance note 15.
Yeah, but we know the guidance says 10.
The guidance says 10 air changes per hour and the entries say 4. So that you do accept then that there's an inconsistency within the environmental matrix itself.
Yeah.
And these entries of 4 air changes per hour, do you also accept that those are inconsistent with what's set out in Table A1 of SHTM 301?
Yeah.
You do, yeah. And while we're here, go a couple of columns along from the one about ventilation supply. You see a column headed up relative pressure.
Yep.
And you just take a moment to look at it. For all of the bed spaces that are not isolation cubicles, do we see that the pressure stated there is positive? And that is consistent with what Table A1 SHTM 0301 requires for rooms in critical care, is that correct?
In terms of the pressure?
The pressure, the positive pressure arrangement.
Yeah.
Okay, so would you agree then that there are at least 2 features here which might be characterised as inconsistencies? First of all, within the environmental matrix itself, there's an inconsistency between the guidance notes saying 10 air changes per hour for HDU in critical care and these particular room entries in critical care where 4 air changes per hour is specified. You accept that's an inconsistency. There's also the inconsistency between the environmental matrix and SHTM 0301. Again, that environmental matrix here says 4 air changes critical care, but the guidance says 10. Were you aware of those inconsistencies during the preferred bidder period?
Not for critical care.
And why not?
The level of detail that we're talking about there was not something that personally I had a requirement to go into.
And is it a level of detail that you would have expected your designers to go into at the preferred bidder stage?
I guess it's difficult to talk for them, but the way that I would use the matrix and how I've outlined earlier, that you're looking into the actual rooms and you're looking to see what's required. If that's what they done also, then wouldn't necessarily expect them to start doing a analytical review of all the different sections to see, because certainly my understanding was this is what the client wanted. And so, you wouldn't forensically analyse anything that a client was wanting when it's specific requirements.
If you take the document as a whole as stating what the client wants, is there not an inconsistency that has to be resolved before you understand the client's requirements between the guidance notes and the room particular details?
No, because the item in the BCR that said that if there was a specific requirement that the board had asked for, I can't remember the exact terminology off the top of my head, but that took precedence. So, that was the overriding requirement. So, that was my interpretation of that.
But just to be clear, did you take that as justifying taking these room particular parameters over, giving priority to them over what was said in the guidance note?
Is there 2 questions here? So is the guidance notes at the front here, or do you mean the guidance notes as in SHTM?
Sorry, I mean the guidance note in the matrix itself.
Well, my interpretation of that was somebody's workings that had being produced as they developed the matrix. So in reality, I wasn't that interested in going through somebody's workings that they might have had with clinical teams or various meetings that you weren't involved in. You don't know what's been agreed. For me, it was about the specifics in the cells and the room types and what was being asked for.
Now, I think what your answers have been quite clear that you weren't aware of these inconsistencies at the time, but do you accept, as a matter of generality, that when an engineer is confronted with an apparent inconsistency between requirements, that the normal judgment would go with the more onerous condition until the matter's been clarified?
I guess it depends what we're actually talking about.
Well, let's say you had been aware that there was a discrepancy between one part of the matrix calling for 10 air changes and another calling for 4. Until it had been clarified which of these was actually wanted, would you agree that the normal judgment an engineer would make to assume the more onerous condition applied?
Thinking about if it was an engineer, when I was an engineer designing and I had two issues that, a higher or lower figure, I wouldn't make any assumption. Whatever the issue was, I would go to whoever it was and raise it with them and see what is it that you actually want.
Now, apart from the entries for the particular rooms on the sheet we're looking at now, requiring 4 air changes per hour, is there anything else that in your view confirmed that 4 air changes per hour was a conscious and deliberate choice on the part of the board?
The main one, I guess, is the sort of general ward bedroom, the single bedroom, where I mentioned earlier about the Hull and Kirkwood analysis reports, the thermal reports, and that the output of that was that it was to be 4 mechanical air changes per hour. So that's one example.
Okay, we can excuse me. We can maybe just have a look at that document. That's bundle 4, page 184. You see a cover page there, headed up with Hulley and Kirkwood's logo, and says Wardroom Thermal Comfort Analysis, February 2012. Is that the report that you had in mind?
Yeah.
And as I understand it, you consider this report to support the view that 4 air changes per hour had been deliberately chosen for single bedrooms. Is that correct?
Deliberately. Yeah. Yeah, my understanding was that there had been work done because of a previous issue on another hospital. And Hull and Kirkwood must have been engaged to produce these reports to see how, by various iterations in terms of the airflow and how much, what would be the minimum amount to stop the room overheating, was my take on that report. However, I did accept that that element wasn't mandatory. We were getting this for information. But it was a useful document to back up the fact that we had 4 air changes in the matrix for the single bedrooms, and that, my take on it was that was the reason.
Okay, so I think you fairly acknowledged there, I think, that this report you understood to be what the tender documents refer to as a non-mandatory or indicative part of the reference design. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you understand the report to offer any support for having 4 air changes per hour in the critical care rooms?
No, I wasn't looking at it in any great detail. It was a, I wasn't differentiating rooms. It was basically, here we had a report. It was a skim through, and it was, in my mind, I then was clear that, this was the reason why 4 was being quoted in environmental matrix, but it wasn't then linking it to different departments or anything. It was just a general review and understanding, really.
Okay. Well, if we look at page 188, just reading from the introduction, says that this study has been prepared by Jonathan McMillan for Hulley Sim, Sustainable Building Design Simulation Division within Hulley and Kirkwood. The purpose of this study is to determine peak annual internal temperature profiles, typical single ward room accommodation. You see there, it's focused on typical single ward room accommodation. And then the executive summary, first bullet point, profiles and simulations 1 and 2 show that the internal temperature of wardrooms be maintained at comfortable levels, 4 air changes per hour, cool, fresh air supply, so on. So that's the point you were making a moment ago, that this report was about how many air changes were needed to achieve particular temperature targets.
Yeah.
And if we go forward to page 194, please. Just reading from the second paragraph, as this study concerns the thermal comfort of wardrooms throughout the building, with the aim of verifying that mechanically ventilated cooled wardrooms have summertime peak temperatures, which provides for robust levels of thermal comfort, whereby internal temperatures of 25 degrees or less can be provided throughout summertime months. It goes on to say, a selection of rooms has been chosen to represent the likely worst case combination of exposure to solar gain, density of occupation, provision of mechanically supplied cool air. So in other words, the author of the design has focused on those rooms where these particular factors are likely to make it most difficult to achieve the temperature target. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Is that your understanding of it? And it goes on to say, as such, critical care and high dependency type ward rooms, which receive air change rates in the region of 10 air changes per hour, not been analysed in this study. So this report is not about rooms in critical care or the high dependency unit. Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
And the reason they were excluded from the study was that they're going to get 10 air changes per hour.
Yeah, I see the statement, yeah.
So in other words, this report doesn't offer, whilst it offers support for 4 air changes per hour in a standard single bedroom, it doesn't offer any support for 4 air changes per hour in a critical care or high dependency unit room. Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
Was that something that you were aware of at the time, back in the preferred bidder period, or is that something that you're only accepting now?
Well, the purpose of the report, and certainly from my reading of it, it wasn't a mandatory document. It was for information, and it was it informed me that they did issues in another hospital, and there was work that had been done. So I wasn't looking at it on the basis of by department. You know, I hadn't been involved in any discussions, and you know, you don't know if there was a suite of these that had been carried out. All it was doing was reinforcing and informing that they had an issue in the hospital. This is what they wanted to try and capture in the new hospital, and I seen it as positive because, you know, the lessons learned philosophy, here we are, you know, it's getting applied. So that was the depth of my review of that document.
Okay. I think another factor that you refer to in your statement as lending support to the view that 4 air changes per hour were wanted in single bedrooms was the energy modelling.
Yeah.
Can you just explain what support that gave?
The support was, in terms of the MEP, it had to be split into 3 work streams, and one of the work streams was energy. The other one was electrical, and the other one was mechanical. And in looking at the energy side, there was a requirement to effectively model the building and its energy use. And so to be able to do that, you have to have a series of templates and input parameters that in effect simulate how the building may operate, the energy that it would use. And in relation to ventilation, Wallace Whittle had developed a template for the single bedroom, and that was based on 4 air changes an hour.
As far as you know, did the inputs for the energy calculations use a particular parameter for rooms in critical care?
I don't know to that extent. It's a very specialist area, and I think the designers would need to respond to that question.
In your statement, you refer to figures in section 4.10 of the project company's proposals. Taking full acknowledgement of what you just explained, maybe just have a look at that. This is paper apart to bundle 5. I think there are 2 papers apart, but this is the bigger paper apart. That one at page 1549. You see there that this is section 4.10, the sustainability and energy model. Was that the modelling that you had in mind?
Yeah, so that was what we would call this a paper output, but with that there was the actual physical model and all the backup that brings.
Okay. If we go to page 1506, see section 3.14, evaluating energy use, space heating, cooling, and so on. And it's just the final sentence of that paragraph. The electronic document, and it gives the name, details the model inputs. That talk there about, I think you said the physical model. Is that what you had in mind?
The electronic document. Yeah.
If you don't know, don't speculate.
Yeah, no, that is.
I was just trying to track down where we would find the the input entries that you were talking about.
Would it be an appendix to this document?
Well,
Yeah.
if we move forward to page 1732, which is still the same part of the project company's proposals, 1700. And this is the list of attachments to that part. You see that these, well, on the face of it, they look like very large documents.
Yeah.
It says that they're transmitted in electronic format. To the best of your knowledge, is it in these that we find the energy inputs that you're talking about?
Yeah, so I think it could be 5.2, suite of sort of individual sheets, and you would have a single bedroom, and it would, from memory, it defines what's been agreed in terms of the 4-year changes.
Yes. And if we could just go to bundle 6. And it's page 322. Just expand that out a bit so we can see it. Now this is a document from IHSL's tender, and in particular relating to section C10, which is about the operational energy model input data. And see, the heading to the document is operational energy model input data. Is this likely to be the same thing that you were referring to a moment ago, or is this something different?
No, that's something different.
Thank you. So you've referred there to two things in support of 4-year changes per hour being a deliberate choice for single rooms. The Hulley and Kirkwood report on thermal comfort and the inputs into the energy model. Apart from those two things, was there anything else, as far as you can recall, to support the idea that 4-year changes per hour was a deliberate choice by the board?
Well, I can recall, the period during financial close where the environmental matrix was replayed back to the board. In that, there was dialogue about 4-year changes and 6.
Okay, we'll come to that. So that's a third thing. Anything else, so far as you can remember, that supported the idea of 4?
I don't think anything else. I mean, obviously, the point is that at that time, we weren't challenging 4 versus 6. We understood that that's what was wanted.
You said not challenging 4 over 6. You mean to say that? It's just that, as I understand it, the discussion has been 4 against 10, but maybe I haven't quite followed that.
Yes, there is a difference between points, and perhaps it will become apparent, I think, when we go through the discussions with the board around that time. I hope we'll clarify it. Just bear with me a moment, Mr. Hall. Now, we could perhaps have a look at some of the tender documents. Now, take what you say earlier, Mr. Hall, that you weren't involved in putting the tender together. But I'd nonetheless like to put some of these to you. So, first of all, if we could go to Bundle 2, page 1004. This is a page from the ITP documents, volume 1, and this is an excerpt from that in relation to, you see down at the bottom of the page, there's reference to C8.3.
Yeah.
You recognise that as reference to part of the mechanical and electrical engineering elements of the tender.
Yeah, so this seed 8.3 is, I recall, it's where using the matrix.
Okay, so probably help you if if I let you read it. So if you just read the first part there of C8.3. So C8.3 is the submission requirement reference, and the text in the next column is headed up submission requirement. We'll need to see the text on that page and then go over to the next page. You just take a moment to read that, please, Mr. Go on to the next page, please. Was that one of the provisions that you referred to earlier on, describing your understanding of what was required of the environmental matrix? Yeah. What did you, was this text that you were aware of at the time?
At the time, in terms of
third bidder period?
Yeah, because that's obviously I had to inform myself of client requirements, etc. So, and this is the sort of comment that I can't quite remember who had said, but this is what formed my opinion that we had the board's requirements as a document.
Now, you see here that this text refers to the environmental matrix as a draft. It also provides that bidders can highlight proposed changes on an exception basis. What did you take from those words?
I didn't pay attention to, what the actual meaning, or it was more about, because you're not, when you're picking up a project to run with, you're not looking to, find errors or issues that, that you're taking it as face value. So what I concluded from that was that it was consistent with the other things I had, and that's why we proceeded with the matrix.
If we go back a page, just look at the paragraph above C8.3. You see that one of the submission requirements for the bidder, text there reads, the following information should also be provided to help demonstrate the design proposals above, including an environmental conditions room provisions matrix, both mechanical and electrical services, each room in the facilities. So did you understand that the bidders were expected to produce an environmental matrix of their own?
I don't really recall reading that information.
And if we take those two paragraphs together that we've just looked at, do you agree that they appear to envisage a development of the environmental matrix from the one that's contained in the tender document?
I think both are quite contradictory in some way. You're getting asked to confirm that you have to accept it, but there may be changes.
Did you understand that through the preferred bidder period, at least open to the bidders to suggest changes to the environmental matrix?
Can't see an instance why you would want to propose changes. I mean, your starting point is you have a client's briefing document. What you did have user groups going on, and you were developing a strategy of M&E. So it's quite foreseeable that through those forums that there could be change. But you know, I didn't envisage that we would be changing, of rooms. You might have changes in terms of the schedule of accommodation, or but changes, as I read this and perceive it, as it's about parameters for each room type, and they've been detailed and have went through a process. To unravel that, you would have to go through all the user group, the medical review, the clinical review. Just there wasn't the time to do that. This was a period of 6 months, and my experience of trying to get clinical people together and estates and infection control, if you wanted to change anything, there just wasn't the time. So my assumption, rightly or wrongly, was that this is what the client wanted and we wouldn't change it.
I appreciate what you've said already today about not having realised that there were discrepancies within the matrix or discrepancies between the matrix and SHTM 0301. But if that had been detected in the preferred bidder period, would you have understood it would be open to the bidders to suggest a change to the environmental matrix to bring it into line with SHTM?
Well, it would have been done through dialogue. If there had been something specific and it would come out in a meeting, and a good example is the 4 and the 6. So where that was raised, we were open and honest about where the 4 was from, and that was then, in my opinion, resolved. So anything that came up, we would not have made specific changes to those kind of figures. We know how important they are and the process that has to go through to get them.
Okay. So that's the ITPD. We have a look at IHSL's tender document. That's bundle 6. Now, if we start off at page. So if you see it down at the bottom, Mr. Hall, this is headed up specification of ventilation systems, and it formed part of IHSL's tender. Is this a document you were familiar with?
I see it's dated the 13th of January 14, so it was dated before I joined the project.
Yes, but is it a document that you would have familiarised yourself with at the start of the third bidder period?
Not that I can recall.
Don't recall. Okay. We see there a reference which begins WW. That'd be a reference to Wallace Whittle.
Yeah.
And then if we move on to the next page, page 4, we see there checked by SMCK. We take that to be a reference to Stuart Keckney.
Yeah.
I'll take you to certain parts of this document, but if you, having looked at these parts, you still don't remember, let me know. We go to page 8, please. What this says at section 5, heading applicable standards, all elements of the work should be in accordance with the requirements of current legislation, regulations, and industry standards unless otherwise stated. Ventilation system shall accord with all appropriate hospital technical memoranda. Down at the bottom, for ventilation air change rates used at the time, subcontractor shall refer to the ADB sheets. And if we go on to page 13, headed up ventilation system. Just go down, like the 4th paragraph from the bottom, provides the air volumes have been established by consideration of heat gains and losses, also the air change rate necessary for comfort and safety, appropriate for the activity carried out in each area. Relative air pressures between rooms should be maintained to suit the activity concerned by design of the supply and extract air volumes. Use of pressure relief equipment where necessary to prevent cross-infection, transfer of unpleasant odours between areas required by the AD. Heat recovery shall be provided between the supply and extract system. Hospital ventilation system be in accordance with SHTM 0301 ventilation in healthcare premises. So it carries on. Having looked at those parts, is this, you remember now if this is a document you're familiar with or not?
I think I might have seen it in another format, but yeah, it looks more that it's the sort of NBS standard outputs that you would use to give to a subcontractor.
The reason for going to it is that, as far as I can see anyway, there's no reference in it to the environmental matrix. This is essentially part of IHSL's tender submission. And the point is really this, that if IHSL at the time saw the environmental matrix as mandatory, we do not expect to see it referred to as a source of the standards instead of SHTM 0301.
I'm not sure of the purpose of the specification, if that was a specification prepared for to procure a subcontractor, and that looks like the kind of wording that's getting used, then the environmental matrix, I don't think would form part of that.
Okay, well, you know, if this is not a document that you're terribly familiar with, we should probably leave that there. In that bundle, if we could go to page 250. You see down at the bottom, this is section C8 of IHSL's tender. And C8 again, is that the reference code for the mechanical and electrical parts of the tender? Is that your recollection?
Yep.
If we go on to page 254, you see there that C8 is about the clarity, robustness and quality of the M&E engineering design proposals. If we go to page 262, please. This is just setting out the board's requirement for this part of the tender. Bidders must submit proposals setting out the engineering services design for each element of the scheme in sufficient detail to demonstrate compliance with the board's construction requirements. think we can take that. That's what this part of IHS tender is do. We go then to page 303. This is, as I understand it, part of IHSL's tender in relation to this part. Down at the bottom, we've got a heading C8.2X, Environmental Conditions Room Matrix. Mechanical and electrical services shall be provided in accordance with the reference design environmental matrix. We shall provide an addendum matrix for any rooms on an exception basis, highlighting any changes at the preferred bid stage. Now, is this a document that you were familiar with at the time? You weren't familiar with this? No. If I was to suggest to you that that passage there indicated that IHSL envisaged at least the possibility of making changes to the environmental matrix, do you agree with that?
Well, I mean, it simply says highlighting any changes. It doesn't say who's making the changes. And it may well have been written on the basis of knowing that you would be developing the design to financial close, that, you know, something may well have come out of the design, be it client driven, probably would have been aware of the sort of schedule of accommodation. It doesn't say what changes are, but I would see it highly unlikely that anybody was going to propose that they would start to change ventilation rates. There's absolutely, doesn't make any sense to change them.
If we go on to the following page.
McLennan, again, my fault. Right, I've got the answer to my question. I just had failed to note the page number, but I now have that. Sorry.
Okay. So if you move to the next page, which is 304, this is headed up. Environmental conditions. We followed the reference design and utilised the reference design. Sorry, just reading from the top there. Followed the reference design and we've utilised the reference matrix. File the room environmental proposal drawings listed below. List of drawings. And below that, room temperature set points, air change rate, and ANDs. Something's missing there, I think. Shall be in accordance with SHDMO 3. And in the table below, you see typical rooms and ventilation air change rates are given. See included in that list, HDU, 10 air changes per hour. And there's also separately bedrooms, 4 air changes per hour, multi-bed wards, 4 air changes per hour. As we see in that table, there's a distinction drawn between the air change rates for high dependency unit and for what you might refer to as standard bedding area.
Yeah, I suspect that that's an extract from the Hulling-Kirkwood environmental matrix.
Okay, but a recognition here in IHSL's tender of different air change rates, HDU, from standard bedrooms.
Yeah.
And then if we go on to the following page, under the heading C8.3 Environmental Matrix, blue language is the board's requirement for this element of the tender, which is the text we've already seen. It says, while bidders are required to undertake their own design, the board has provided a draft environmental matrix as part of the ITP documentation. Bidders must confirm acceptance of the board's environmental matrix, highlighting any proposed changes on an exception basis. Then below that, we have the IHSL response on that issue. What they say is, as indicated above, no changes proposed at this time, nor envisaged in the future, but we will continue to review and advise back. So I think the first part of that is consistent with what you were saying a moment ago, that you would see it, there wouldn't be any reason to change the environmental parameters. But do we see there that, at least at this stage, an anticipation of, at the very least, a possibility that the environmental matrix would be changed through the design development process?
Yeah, I just don't know the definition of changed. You know, because if you're adding in room numbers or the schedule of accommodation, my opinion is that that's not changed to your fundamental parameters that have been defined in terms of the environmental figures.
Are you talking there about the type of change where, for example, you're adding in new rooms which weren't contemplated at the time the original environmental matrix was prepared?
Yeah.
And if it was to be suggested to you that this text here at least envisages the possibility of change to the given parameters for those rooms already in the matrix, do you accept that, or would you do that?
I would disagree, and I think, you know, most engineers, if they are given client's requirement that has all the environmental parameters in it, I can't understand why that you would want to change them.
Even when that wording says, this is the black wording by IHSL, as indicated above, no changes proposed at this time nor envisaged in the future, but we will continue to review and advise back. Does that not indicate that IHSL are going to review what's in the matrix, let the board know if changes are needed?
Well, bearing in mind, I wasn't involved, I didn't write it, and I'm trying to interpret what somebody else has written. But if you take that paragraph as a whole and you put yourself into a position that you've got 3 bidders that want to win a project, clients telling you that you have to agree to the environmental matrix, you know, to start to be suggesting that you're going to change it could ultimately mean that you would lose points in terms of a scoring. So my interpretation of that would be that you wouldn't start to be suggesting things that could ultimately impact on your tender.
And just as an aside, Mr. Hall, I should explain that when I'm putting these documents to you, and the fault will be mine if I'm asking the question, not really what, doesn't really matter what your interpretation of the document is. What I'm trying to understand is your understanding of the job that was being done during the preferred bidder period. If that makes sense to you.
Yeah.
But your answers have been. If we could also go to page 323 in that document. So this is another part of IHSL's tender submission. It's headed up Tender Package, Building Services, Deliverables. Again, dated before you joined the project, but presumably this was one of the documents at least available to you. Is it one that you recall?
I'd need to see the content to try and.
If we maybe just scroll on to the next page. And again, the following page. Again, does any of that look familiar to you?
It wasn't something I was using on a day-to-day basis. It would have existed in our portfolio of specifications. And
if we just go to page 350, we'll go to the page. It's simply at paragraph 5.9.7, the heading is mechanical ventilation system. And it says the ventilation systems of the hospital are designed in accordance with Scottish Health Technical Memorandum SHTM 0301. Was it your understanding that that was the objective of the IHSL design?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we talk about the table at the back of the SHTM, but there are nearly 200 pages in SHTM 0301, and so there's a requirement to comply with that document, putting aside what was in the actual environmental matrix. So the actual design has been done to the SHTM 0301, other than, in my understanding, the environmental matrix where it didn't apply.
Okay. And just trying to draw all of that together, I would suggest to you that it indicates IHSL meant to comply with SHTM 0301, but also keep the environmental matrix under review through the design development process. And it was open to them to suggest changes for compliance with guidance. Does that reflect your understanding of the job you were doing or not?
It doesn't reflect in terms of open to offer alternatives and changes. That's not something that I can relate to.
There's just another point that I've been asked to put to you, which is in relation to, if you go to bundle 5, please, at 289. It's my fault. I should have asked you this earlier, Mr. Hall. When we looked at, this is back in the board's construction requirements. We looked at the first sentence there of paragraph 8, which says Project Co shall provide the works to comply with the environmental matrix. That's one of the sources you referred to in your statement, justifying your view how it was to be treated. You read the paragraph following that, it says Project Co shall, in carrying out the works, comply with the following non-exhaustive list of mechanical and electrical requirements. And if you read down the page, you see that there's a section headed up minimum engineering standards. It says, then going over the page after that list, then a paragraph that reads the design of the environmental control system, or that, carrying on, following is a non-exhaustive list of SHTMs, so on, applicable to the facilities. And we see down at letter H, SHTM 0301 appears. See that?
Yeah.
And were you aware of that list of standards applied with?
Yes, I was aware of them, yeah.
And that influenced the way that you read the opening sentence at section 8. In other words, did you see that list as in any way qualifying the obligation to comply with the environmental matrix?
No, I mean, my understanding at the time was that we had this client briefing document that told us what was required environmentally, the BCR at the section 2.3, where unless it's something different. And so on that basis, I didn't see that, that this list of standards would apply to the matrix and what was in the matrix. But obviously, in terms of the nearly 200 pages worth of information in an SHTM, we were complying with on the design. So if, for instance, the bedroom was asking for 4 air changes, then it requires a designer to design a ventilation system, putting aside what the number is to comply with the document.
But
So it's not totally excluding the SHTM and saying we're not doing anything?
Yeah. Just to make sure I've understood that, you would regard your obligation, your employer's obligation as being, or IHSL's obligation as being to comply with SHTM 0301, except insofar as different parameters are specified in the environmental matrix. Okay, we're finished with that document now, thank you. I'd like to move on now to take a look at what happened to the environmental matrix over the preferred bidder period for Hall. And if we could just start, first of all, with Bundle 10, Volume 2, at page 1032. And if we see down at the bottom of the page an email from, I think it's Brian Rutherford, to you of the 11th of June 2014. See that heading?
Yep.
Who's Brian Rutherford?
Brian Rutherford's the senior mechanical engineer at Wallace Whittle.
Okay. If we could just go down to the next page, please, see the text of his email to you. He says, Ken, our understanding is that theatres have been confirmed as not requiring humidification. Seeking clarification as to whether the humidification is still required within the HDU critical care areas. The subject matter of this particular query is not so much important as who's asking what of whom. So do we see there that Brian Rutherford of Wallace Whittle is asking you for clarification about whether or not humidification is needed in HDU and critical care? That was the purpose of his.
Yeah, so the normal procedure was if there were any aspects that required clarification, Wallace Whittle would issue them to us and then we would issue them to the board to achieve clarification.
Okay, and so if we go back a page to 1302, do we see there about the middle of the page an email from you to Maureen Brown at Mott MacDonald saying, and a copy to Graham Greer at Mott MacDonald, Maureen Graham, would it be possible to confirm these requirements for Wallace Whittle, please?
Yeah.
And so that's you effectively passing on the query from Wallace Whittle to the board. So it may sound a daft question, but who, in your view, determining whether or not humidification was needed?
Well, we were asking the board. It was the board that were to confirm. I mean, the background to humidification is that I think it was used years ago, and there was a certain type of gas that could be flammable, and therefore I think that gas is no longer used, and so I think the BCR calls for space for humidification. So looking at these dates here, that was around the time that Wallace Whittle were assessing spatial requirements in plant rooms and corridors and things, so they're probably linked to that.
Okay. And if we just look at the reference, environmental matrix from that time, which is Bundle 4, page 132. We can expand that text, read it, particularly Guidance Note 15. Did we see there that the fourth paragraph down within Guidance Note 15? Sorry, it's the fifth one. The fourth one. Central AHU plant requires humidification to achieve RH range during winter. That's an HDU. Then in the critical care section of that guidance note, second paragraph, again, do we see critical, not sure if everybody else has lost the document, but have you got a document in front of you, Mr.
Well, seems to be a pattern of technical issues approximating what would otherwise be breaks. But before we rise, I think the original plan had been to take a further witness today. Now, where are we on that?
I think my best judgment is that we probably won't be able to start the other witness today, my lord.
Very well. That's probably as much information as I require at this stage. I'll just proceed on that basis. Mr. Hall, we had hoped to include your evidence this morning, but done that, and therefore I would ask you to come back. When I say come back at 2 o'clock. We'll take what we would have otherwise taken as lunch break. So, ladies and gentlemen, we will sit again at 2. Appreciate there may be questions as to whether legal representatives wish to require further questioning, but we'll deal with that if and when it arises. But Mr. Greer, who I think was otherwise scheduled for this afternoon, will not be taken this afternoon, and we'll give you information as to when he will be taken. But for the moment, we'll rise for lunch. Yeah.